What happens when a single photograph destroys decades of carefully constructed lies? When Princess Isabella discovered the truth hidden in her stepmother's jewelry box, she never imagined it would threaten to bring down the entire monarchy of Aldermere. Some secrets are worth dying for, and some are worth killing for. In the grand halls of Ravencrest Palace, where every whisper echoes and every glance carries weight, one woman's desperate attempt to protect her past is about to collide with another's determination to expose the truth. This is the story of how a simple ring became the catalyst for the greatest royal scandal in centuries, and how the bonds of family can both protect and destroy everything you hold dear. The crown has never felt heavier, and trust has never been more fragile. Welcome to a world where loyalty is currency, secrets are weapons, and the price of truth might be higher than anyone is willing to pay. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Ravencrest Palace as Princess Isabella made her way through the corridors she had called home for the past 15 years. At 28, she had grown accustomed to the weight of expectation that came with being the heir to the throne of Aldermere, but today felt different. Today, the very air seemed thick with unspoken tensions. Isabella paused outside the ornate double doors of her father's study, her hand hovering over the golden handle. Through the heavy wood, she could hear raised voices, her father, King Edmund, and her stepmother, Queen Victoria. They had been arguing more frequently lately, their conversations ending abruptly whenever Isabella entered a room. The kingdom's newspapers had begun to speculate about trouble in the royal marriage, though the palace had issued firm denials. She pressed her ear closer to the door, knowing it was improper but unable to resist. Her stepmother's voice was sharp, desperate. "Edmund, you don't understand. If she finds out about the ring, everything we've built will crumble. The people will never forgive us." "Victoria, you're being paranoid," came her father's weary reply. Isabella would never what? Never question why her mother really died. Never wonder why there are no photographs of the funeral. Never ask why you married me just 3 months later. Victoria's voice cracked with emotion. "She's not a child anymore, Edmund. She's starting to ask questions." Isabella's heart hammered in her chest. Her mother, Queen Elizabeth, had died in a car accident when Isabella was 13. Or at least, that's what she had always been told. The grief had been overwhelming, made worse by her father's quick remarriage to Victoria Blackwood, a wealthy widow from the neighboring kingdom of Westmarch. Isabella had tried to be understanding. Her father had been devastated, and Victoria had seemed genuinely caring. But now, hearing these fragments of conversation, doubt began to creep in like poison. The sound of footsteps approaching from behind made Isabella step back from the door quickly. She turned to see Margaret, her lady-in-waiting and closest friend since childhood, approaching with a worried expression. "Your Highness, you have the charity luncheon in an hour," Margaret whispered, her eyes darting nervously toward the study doors. "Perhaps we should." The doors suddenly opened, and Queen Victoria emerged, her usually perfect composure slightly frayed. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and her green eyes held a haunted quality that Isabella had never noticed before. Victoria was beautiful in a cold, calculating way, and she had always been kind to Isabella, though their relationship remained formal despite the years. "Isabella, dear," Victoria said, forcing a smile. "I didn't realize you were here. I was just coming to speak with Father about the new hospital wing dedication," Isabella replied smoothly, though her mind was racing with questions. Victoria's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "He's rather busy this morning. Perhaps this afternoon would be better?" Without waiting for a response, she glided past them, her heels clicking sharply against the marble. King Edmund appeared in the doorway, his usually commanding presence diminished by exhaustion. At 55, he remained a handsome man with silver threads running through his dark hair, but the stress of recent months had aged him. His blue eyes, so similar to Isabella's own, held a sadness that seemed to deepen each day. "Isabella," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "What brings you here so early?" "Just wanted to discuss the hospital visit, Father." "But if you're busy, no, come in." He stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter the study while nodding for Margaret to wait outside. The study was Edmund's sanctuary, filled with leather-bound books, family portraits, and the heavy scent of pipe tobacco. Isabella took a seat in one of the burgundy chairs across from his massive oak desk, the same chair where she had received countless lectures about duty, responsibility, and the weight of the crown. "Isabella, I want you to know that whatever difficulties Victoria and I may be experiencing, it has nothing to do with you. Edmund began, settling behind his desk. Marriage is complicated, especially under the scrutiny we face. Is that all it is? Marriage difficulties. Isabella leaned forward, her voice gentle but probing. Father, I heard you mention mother's name. And something about a ring. Edmund's face went pale, and, for a moment, he looked every one of his 55 years. You misheard. We were discussing estate matters. Your mother's jewelry was being cataloged for insurance purposes. The lie hung between them like a curtain, and Isabella felt a chill run down her spine. Her father had never lied to her before, or if he had been much better at it. The realization that he was keeping something from her about her own mother's death was devastating. Father, may I see mother's jewelry? I've been thinking about wearing something of hers to the state dinner next week. Edmund's hands fidgeted with the papers on his desk. Of course, dear. I'll have Victoria show you the collection this afternoon. She's been organizing things. Isabella nodded, though every instinct told her that her stepmother was the last person she wanted involved in anything concerning her mother's belongings. I'd prefer to look through them myself, if that's all right. It would be more meaningful that way. I understand, but Victoria knows where everything is kept. The jewelry has been moved to different locations for security reasons. Edmund's voice carried a finality that Isabella recognized. The discussion was over. As she left the study, Isabella's mind was churning with questions and possibilities. Margaret fell into step beside her, and they walked in silence until they reached Isabella's private apartments. The rooms were decorated in soft blues and golds, with photographs of her mother scattered throughout. Looking at them now, Isabella realized how few there actually were, and how none showed her mother wearing any significant jewelry. Margaret, do you remember my mother's jewelry? Isabella asked as her friend began laying out clothes for the charity luncheon. Margaret paused, a thoughtful expression crossing her features. She was the same age as Isabella, with auburn hair and kind brown eyes. Her family had served the royal household for generations, and she had been Isabella's constant companion through the darkest period of her life. I remember she had beautiful pieces, Your Highness. There was a particular ring she wore often, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds. She said it had been in her family for generations. Isabella felt a spark of recognition. A sapphire ring? Are you certain? Oh yes, she never took it off. Even wore it to bed. She loved it so much. She used to tell you stories about it, how it had protected the women in her family for centuries. Margaret's voice grew softer. I always wondered why they buried her without it. Seemed unlike your father to not honor her wishes that way. The pieces of the puzzle began to shift and rearrange in Isabella's mind. If her mother had been buried without the ring, where was it now? And why had Victoria mentioned a ring in such panicked tones? The charity luncheon passed in a blur of polite conversation and forced smiles. Isabella found herself studying every guest, wondering who among them might know the truth about her mother's death. The event was held at the Grand Hotel Aldermere, one of the kingdom's most prestigious establishments. Isabella moved through the crowd with practiced grace, shaking hands, and making small talk about various charitable endeavors. Lady Catherine Ashford, one of her mother's oldest friends, approached during the reception. She was an elegant woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp intelligence in her eyes. Isabella, my dear, you look more like your mother every day, Lady Catherine said warmly, though her expression grew troubled. I've been meaning to speak with you about something. Of course, Lady Catherine. What is it? Lady Catherine glanced around nervously before speaking in a lowered voice. It's about your mother's ring. The sapphire one. I saw it at an auction house in London last month. The auctioneer said it came from an anonymous seller in Aldermere. I thought you should know. Isabella felt the blood drain from her face. Are you certain it was hers? Absolutely. I helped her choose it for her 21st birthday. There's an inscription inside the band. For Elizabeth, with eternal love, Mother. I couldn't mistake it. The revelation hit Isabella like a physical blow. If her mother's ring was being sold at auction, then someone had taken it after her death. Someone with access to the royal apartments. Someone who might have been closer to her mother than anyone realized. Lady Catherine continued, her voice barely above a whisper. There's something else, dear. I never believed the official story about the accident. Your mother was an excellent driver, and the weather was clear that night. She was planning to tell you something important about your heritage on your 14th birthday. She mentioned it to me several times. What kind of something? I'm not sure, but it had to do with your bloodline. Something about your right to rule not coming just from your father's side. Lady Catherine's eyes darted around the room again. Perhaps it's nothing, but with the ring appearing at auction, Isabella spent the rest of the event in a daze, going through the motions while her mind raced with possibilities. When she returned to the palace, she immediately went to her mother's portrait gallery, a small room off the main library where her father had hung paintings and photographs of Queen Elizabeth. She studied each image carefully, paying particular attention to her mother's hands. In several of the paintings, the sapphire ring was clearly visible, just as Margaret had described. But in the official portraits taken in the year before her death, the ring was notably absent. The sound of approaching footsteps made her turn. Queen Victoria stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the hallway light. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something predatory in her stance. "I thought I might find you here," Victoria said, stepping into the room. "Your father mentioned you were interested in seeing your mother's jewelry." "Yes, I was hoping to wear something of hers to the state dinner." Victoria moved closer, her eyes scanning the portraits with an intensity that made Isabella uncomfortable. "Your mother had exquisite taste, though I'm afraid many of her most valuable pieces have been placed in the royal vault for security reasons." "Including her sapphire ring?" Victoria's reaction was subtle but unmistakable, a slight tightening around her eyes, a momentary pause before answering. "I'm not sure which ring you mean, dear." She had several sapphire pieces. Isabella decided to take a risk. The one with her mother's inscription. The one that was supposedly buried with her. This time, Victoria's composure cracked completely. Her face went white, and she gripped the back of a nearby chair. "Who told you about that?" "So you do know the ring I mean." Victoria seemed to realize her mistake. She straightened, attempting to regain her regal bearing. "Of course I know it. I helped select her burial jewelry. But, Isabella, some things are better left in the past. Not when they concern my mother's memory." Isabella's voice carried a steel that surprised them both. "I want to see the ring, Victoria." Now, the two women stared at each other across the portrait-filled room, the painted eyes of Queen Elizabeth seeming to watch over their confrontation. Victoria's internal struggle was visible on her face. She clearly wanted to refuse, but she also seemed to realize that Isabella would not be easily deterred. "Very well," Victoria said finally. "But you must understand, some secrets exist to protect the people we love. Your father has carried a tremendous burden to keep you safe." "Safe from what?" Victoria didn't answer. Instead, she led Isabella through the palace corridors to a section of the royal apartments that had been off-limits since Isabella's childhood. They stopped before a heavy door that Victoria unlocked with a key from her personal collection. The room beyond was Victoria's private study, far more austere than Edmund's, with clean lines and minimal decoration. Victoria moved to an antique secretary desk and opened a hidden compartment, withdrawing a small velvet box. "Before I show you this, I need you to promise me something," Victoria said, her voice trembling slightly. "Promise me that you'll hear the whole story before making any judgments." Isabella nodded, though her heart was pounding so hard she could barely hear her own thoughts. Victoria opened the box, revealing the most beautiful ring Isabella had ever seen. The sapphire was deep blue, almost the color of midnight, surrounded by diamonds that caught the light like captured stars. Even in the subdued lighting of the study, it seemed to glow with an inner fire. "This was your mother's most treasured possession," Victoria said softly. "But it's also the most dangerous thing in the kingdom. The inscription inside doesn't just say, 'with eternal love,' it contains a secret that could destroy the monarchy." Isabella reached for the ring with trembling fingers. As she turned it to examine the inscription, she saw additional text that Lady Catherine hadn't mentioned, tiny letters etched below the loving message from her grandmother. The words were in Latin, and it took her a moment to translate them. When she did, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. "Rightful Queen of Aldermere and Westmarch, daughter of 2 crowns, heir to the ancient pact." Isabella looked up at Victoria, whose face was now streaked with tears. "What does this mean?" "It means your mother wasn't just the Queen of Aldermere," Victoria whispered. "She was also the rightful ruler of Westmarch. And it means that you, Isabella, have a claim to both thrones that supersedes everyone, including your father's." The implications crashed over Isabella like a wave. If this was true, then her mother's death took on an entirely different significance. And Victoria's presence in their lives, her quick marriage to Edmund, her obvious access to royal secrets, it all suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. "You're from Westmarch," Isabella said, the pieces falling into place. "You knew about Mother's claim." Victoria nodded miserably. "I was her cousin, her rival. And now, God forgive me, I'm her daughter's stepmother, and the woman who has spent 15 years trying to cover up the truth about why she really died. The ring felt heavy in Isabella's palm, weighted with generations of secrets and the burden of a truth that could reshape 2 kingdoms. She looked at the woman who had raised her, who had comforted her through nightmares and celebrated her achievements, and realized that nothing in her life had been as simple as she had believed. Outside the study windows, storm clouds were gathering over the palace grounds, and Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that the tempest building in the sky was nothing compared to the one that was about to engulf her family. The silence in Victoria's study stretched between them like a chasm. Isabella stared at the ring in her palm, its sapphire depths seeming to hold centuries of secrets. Her stepmother stood frozen beside the desk, tears still tracking down her cheeks, waiting for Isabella's reaction to the revelation that had just shattered everything the princess thought she knew about her identity. "My mother was the rightful queen of Westmarch," Isabella said slowly, testing the words on her tongue. "And you're her cousin, her rival." She looked up at Victoria, searching for any sign of deception in those green eyes. "Tell me everything. Start from the beginning." Victoria moved to close the study door and engage the lock. When she turned back, her regal composure had completely crumbled, replaced by the exhaustion of someone who had been carrying an unbearable secret for too long. "Your mother, Elizabeth, and I were born 6 months apart," Victoria began, sinking into a chair opposite Isabella. "Our mothers were sisters, daughters of King Frederick of Westmarch. But there was a complication in the line of succession." Isabella remained standing, the ring clutched tightly in her fist. "What kind of complication?" "The ancient laws of Westmarch stated that the crown would pass to the eldest daughter of the eldest daughter. Your grandmother, Princess Margaret, was indeed the elder sister. But she died in childbirth when your mother was born. My mother, Princess, and claimed that made her the heir since Margaret was no longer alive to inherit." The family politics were already becoming complex, but Isabella pressed on. "So there were 2 claimants to the Westmarch throne." "Exactly. The matter was supposed to be resolved by the Council of Lords when we came of age. But your mother complicated things by falling in love with your father and marrying into the Aldermere royal family. She essentially abdicated her claim to Westmarch by accepting the crown of Aldermere." Victoria paused, reaching for a crystal decanter on her desk and pouring herself a measure of brandy with shaking hands. Or so everyone thought. But she didn't really abdicate. No, the ancient pact between Aldermere and Westmarch, signed centuries ago, stated that a marriage between the royal houses would unite the kingdoms under a single crown. Your mother's marriage to Edmund didn't invalidate her claim to Westmarch. It actually strengthened her position. She became the legitimate ruler of both kingdoms. Isabella felt the weight of this revelation settling on her shoulders like a mantle. "And that claim passes to me." "Not just passes, Isabella. According to the bloodline laws, you were born the rightful queen of both Aldermere and Westmarch. Your father has been ruling Aldermere as a regent, and Victoria's voice broke. "I've been ruling Westmarch as a usurper." The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they formed was uglier than Isabella had imagined. "That's why you married father so quickly after mother's death. To legitimize your position." Victoria nodded miserably. "The marriage gave me a claim to Aldermere's protection and made it politically difficult for anyone to challenge my rule in Westmarch. Your father, he genuinely cared for me, but I manipulated his grief and his desire to provide you with a mother figure." Isabella began pacing the small study, her mind racing with implications. The car accident that killed mother. It wasn't really an accident, was it? The brandy glass slipped from Victoria's hands, shattering on the stone floor. "Isabella, please, you have to understand. Did you kill my mother?" Isabella's voice was deadly quiet. "No." Victoria stood up abruptly, her hands shaking. "I swear to you on everything sacred, I did not kill Elizabeth." "But," she took a shuddering breath, "I know who did." The admission hung in the air like a poison cloud. Isabella stopped pacing and turned to face her stepmother fully. "Who?" "The Shadow Council of Westmarch. They're a group of nobles who have been manipulating the succession for decades. When your mother began making inquiries about formally claiming her Westmarch inheritance, she wanted to pass both kingdoms to you united. They saw it as a threat to their power." Isabella's mind reeled. A secret council ordered my mother's assassination. They couldn't afford to let her unite the kingdoms. A unified Aldermere Westmarch would be too powerful, too stable. They thrive on division and conflict. So they arranged the accident, made it look like a tragic mishap. And you know this because? Victoria's next words came out in a rush, as if she had been holding them back for years. Because they approached me first. They offered to support my claim to Westmarch in exchange for keeping the kingdom separate. I was young, ambitious, and I thought I loved someone who could never love me back as long as Elizabeth was alive. Isabella felt sick. You were in love with my father. I had been in love with Edmund since we were teenagers. He visited Westmarch often for diplomatic reasons, and I convinced myself that he would have chosen me if Elizabeth hadn't been born with the stronger claim. Victoria's voice was thick with shame. When the Shadow Council approached me with their plan, I didn't agree to murder, but I didn't try to stop it either. The betrayal cut deep, but Isabella forced herself to think clearly. What exactly did you know? I knew they were planning something for her birthday celebration. I thought they might kidnap her, force her to renounce her claims publicly. I never imagined. Victoria pressed her hands to her face. When I heard about the accident, I was as shocked as everyone else. But then, Lord Blackwood, their leader, came to me with proof of what they had done and an ultimatum. Lord Blackwood. Isabella recognized the name. Your late husband. My first marriage was arranged by the Shadow Council. Blackwood was their way of controlling me. He showed me photographs from the accident scene, evidence that the car had been sabotaged. He said that if I didn't cooperate with their plans, they would blame the assassination on your father, claim that Edmund had his wife killed to prevent the unification of the kingdoms. The manipulation was staggering in its complexity. Isabella could see how a young woman, faced with such threats and overwhelmed by political forces beyond her understanding, might have felt trapped. So you agreed to marry father and keep the secret. I thought I was protecting him. And protecting you. Victoria's eyes were desperate now, pleading for understanding. Isabella, you have to believe me. Every day for the past 15 years, I've lived with the knowledge that I helped destroy the most wonderful woman I ever knew. I've tried to be a good stepmother, to honor Elizabeth's memory by caring for you. Isabella studied Victoria's face, searching for deception but finding only anguish and regret. The ring. How did you get it? After the funeral, I went through Elizabeth's personal effects to make sure there was nothing that would raise questions about her true heritage. I found the ring and realized immediately how dangerous it was. The inscription would lead anyone who saw it to ask exactly the questions you're asking now. So you kept it hidden. I told everyone it had been buried with her, and I had a replica made for the official inventory. I've kept the real ring ever since, hoping that someday I would find the courage to give it to you and tell you the truth. Isabella opened her hand and looked at the ring again. In the lamplight, the sapphire seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. Does father know any of this? Victoria shook her head. Edmund believes the official story. He thinks Elizabeth died in a tragic accident, and he has no idea about her Westmarch heritage or the Shadow Council. I've protected him from the truth because I knew it would destroy him. But he suspects something. I could hear it in your argument this morning. He's been asking more questions lately, especially as your coronation approaches. The political pressure to formalize the succession is mounting, and he's starting to wonder why I'm so reluctant to discuss certain aspects of the transition. Isabella's coronation was scheduled for the following year, on her 30th birthday. It was meant to be a celebration of the continuity of the Aldermere monarchy, but now she realized it would also be a moment of reckoning for secrets that had been buried for too long. Victoria, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Isabella's voice carried the authority of her royal training. Are you still working with the Shadow Council? The question seemed to age Victoria before Isabella's eyes. Not working with them, no. But I'm still trapped by them. Lord Blackwood is dead, but his son Marcus has taken over leadership of the council. He sends me messages occasionally, reminding me of what they know, what they could reveal if I ever tried to expose the truth. What kind of messages? Victoria moved to her desk and withdrew a small stack of letters tied with black ribbon. These arrived over the past few months. They're getting more frequent as your coronation approaches. Isabella took the letters and read the top one. The handwriting was elegant, but the content was chilling. Dear Victoria, I trust you remember our family's arrangement regarding the unfortunate incident of 15 years ago. As Princess Isabella's coronation approaches, we feel it's important to remind you that certain truths must remain buried. We would hate for King Edmund to learn about his wife's real intentions, or about his current wife's involvement in preventing them. The Shadow Council hopes for your continued cooperation. Regards, Marcus Blackwood. The threat was clear, but something about the letter bothered Isabella. Victoria, look at this signature. Look at the seal. Victoria examined the letter more closely. What about it? The seal is wrong. This isn't the official Blackwood family crest. And the paper, it's high quality, but it's not from Westmarch. The watermark is from a London stationer. Isabella's mind was working rapidly now, drawing on years of education in diplomatic protocols and royal correspondence. These letters aren't coming from Westmarch at all. Someone here in Aldermere is pretending to be the Shadow Council. Victoria looked stunned. But who would know enough about the arrangement to? She stopped mid-sentence, her face going pale. Oh God. Edmund. Father? You think Father is sending these letters? Think about it, Isabella. He would have access to all the intelligence reports about the Shadow Council. He would know about Blackwood's death and his son's succession. And he's been acting so strangely lately, asking pointed questions about my past. Isabella felt the world tilting again. If her father knew the truth about her mother's death, if he had known all along, then everything about their family dynamic became suspect. But there was another possibility that chilled her even more. Or someone else who has access to royal intelligence. Someone who knows about the Shadow Council and wants to use that knowledge for their own purposes. They stared at each other as the implications sank in. If someone in the Aldermere court was manipulating Victoria, using her past connections to the Westmarch conspiracy, then Isabella's claim to both thrones made her not just a target, but a pawn in a game she was only beginning to understand. I need to see my father, Isabella said, slipping the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all these years. And I need to know who else has access to classified information about Westmarch. Victoria grabbed her arm as she headed for the door. Isabella, please be careful who you trust. If someone has been manipulating me for months, they've been planning something. Your coronation, your marriage negotiations with the Duke of Ravenna, the trade agreements with Westmarch, it's all connected somehow. Isabella paused. She had been so focused on the immediate revelations about her mother and her heritage that she hadn't considered the broader political implications. Her engagement to Duke Alessandro of Ravenna had been announced just 2 months ago, and the marriage was meant to strengthen Aldermere's position in the region. But if someone knew about her claim to Westmarch, they might be trying to prevent or control that unification. The Duke, Isabella said slowly. Victoria, what do you know about Alessandro's family connections? Victoria's face went white. His grandmother was Princess Sophia of Westmarch, Elizabeth's cousin. Isabella, if Alessandro knows about your dual inheritance. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. Isabella's engagement hadn't been a romantic alliance or even a purely political one. It was another move in the same game that had killed her mother 15 years ago. I need Margaret, Isabella said urgently. And I need a way to communicate with Westmarch directly, without going through official diplomatic channels. Victoria nodded, moving quickly to a hidden panel in her bookshelf. I've maintained some contacts over the years, people who knew your mother and believed in her claim. But, Isabella, if you're thinking of trying to claim your Westmarch inheritance, you'll be putting yourself in direct danger. I'm already in danger, Isabella replied, looking down at her mother's ring. The only question is whether I'm going to face it as a victim or as a queen. As they prepared to leave the study, Victoria caught Isabella's hand one more time. There's something else you need to know. The reason your mother was going to tell you about your heritage on your 14th birthday, it wasn't just about the crowns. There are other heirs, other claimants who have been waiting and hiding for the right moment to emerge. Your claim to both thrones makes you the key to a succession crisis that involves 3 kingdoms, not just 2. 3 kingdoms. Ravenna. Alessandro's family has been playing a long game, positioning themselves to benefit from the chaos when the truth about the Westmarch succession finally comes to light. Your engagement to him isn't just about politics, it's about control. Isabella felt the full weight of her mother's legacy settling on her shoulders. She was not just inheriting one crown, but stepping into the center of a conflict that had been brewing for decades. And somewhere in the shadows, people who had killed once to prevent the unification of kingdoms were undoubtedly prepared to kill again. As thunder rumbled overhead, and the first drops of rain began to strike the windows of Victoria's study, Isabella realized that her coronation would either mark the beginning of a new era of peace and prosperity, or the starting point of a war that would reshape the political landscape of Europe forever. The ring on her finger seemed to pulse with warmth, and, for just a moment, Isabella could swear she felt her mother's presence, urging her forward into a future that would demand every ounce of courage, intelligence, and strength she possessed. The storm that had been brewing all day finally, unleashed its fury as Isabella made her way through the palace corridors toward her father's private chambers. Lightning illuminated the tall windows, casting dramatic shadows that seemed to shift and dance with her troubled thoughts. The sapphire ring felt warm against her finger, a tangible connection to a mother she was only now beginning to truly know. Margaret appeared at her side as if summoned by telepathy, falling into step with the practiced ease of 15 years of friendship. "Your Highness, you look troubled. The charity luncheon went well, didn't it?" "Margaret, I need you to do something for me. And I need you to ask no questions until I can explain everything." Isabella's voice was low, urgent. "I need you to find out everything you can about Duke Alessandro's family history, particularly any connections to Westmarch royalty." Margaret's steps faltered slightly, but her training as a lady-in-waiting kept her expression neutral. "Of course, Your Highness. How deep should I dig?" "All the way to the foundation. And, Margaret, be discreet. If anyone asks why you're researching the Duke's family, tell them I'm having some wedding jewelry designed and want to incorporate family crests." They stopped outside King Edmund's chambers, where 2 guards stood at attention. Isabella dismissed them with a nod, something that would have been unusual under normal circumstances, but which they accepted without question. As the guards withdrew to the end of the hallway, Isabella turned to Margaret once more. "There's something else. I need you to send a message to Lady Catherine Ashford. Tell her I would very much like to hear more about my mother's friendship with the people of Westmarch. Arrange a private meeting for tomorrow evening." Margaret's eyes showed a flicker of curiosity, but she simply curtsied and withdrew. Isabella took a deep breath and knocked on her father's door. "Enter," came Edmund's voice from within. Isabella found her father standing by the window, watching the storm rage across the palace grounds. He had changed from his formal morning attire into a simple shirt and trousers, making him look more like the father who had comforted her during childhood nightmares than the King of Aldermere. "The storm matches my mood," he said without turning around. "Isabella, I owe you an apology for this morning. Victoria and we've been under a great deal of stress lately." "What kind of stress, father?" Edmund finally turned to face her, and Isabella was struck by how much he seemed to have aged in just the past few hours. His eyes were bloodshot, and deep lines of worry creased his forehead. "Political pressures. Your engagement, the upcoming coronation, trade negotiations with neighboring kingdoms. Being a monarch means never having a moment's peace." He moved to a chair near the fireplace and gestured for her to join him. "But enough about my troubles. How are your wedding preparations progressing?" Isabella settled into the chair across from him, studying his face carefully. "Father, how well do you know Duke Alessandro? I mean, beyond the political advantages of our alliance." Edmund's expression grew cautious. "He comes from a good family, well respected in diplomatic circles. His father was instrumental in the peace treaties of the last decade." "Why do you ask?" "I've been thinking about Mother lately, about her connections to other royal families. I was wondering if she and Alessandro's family had any history together." The change in Edmund's demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. His hands tightened slightly on the arms of his chair, and his gaze shifted away from her face. "Isabella, your mother's family connections are complex. I think it's best if we focus on building new relationships rather than dwelling on old ones. But surely there's no harm in understanding our family's diplomatic history?" Isabella pressed, slipping her mother's ring off her finger and placing it on the small table between their chairs. "I found this among some old jewelry today. Victoria said it belonged to Mother." Edmund's reaction was immediate and dramatic. He lurched forward in his chair, his face going completely white as he stared at the ring. "Where did you get this?" "I told you. Victoria gave it to me. She said it had been in storage for security reasons." Isabella kept her voice carefully neutral, but she was watching every micro-expression on her father's face. "Victoria had this." Edmund's voice was barely above a whisper. "She told me. She said it had been lost in the accident." The admission confirmed Isabella's growing suspicions. "So you do recognize it?" Edmund reached for the ring with trembling fingers, turning it to examine the inscription. As he read the Latin text, his face cycled through a range of emotions: recognition, grief, and, finally, a deep, burning anger. "She lied to me," he said, and Isabella wasn't sure if he was referring to Victoria or her mother. 15 years of lies. "Father, what does the inscription mean?" "Victoria told me it has something to do with Mother's heritage, but I want to hear it from you." Edmund was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years of suppressed knowledge. Your mother was the rightful queen of Westmarch, Isabella. She was also, by extension and through our marriage, the legitimate ruler of both kingdoms. This ring is proof of her bloodline, and, by inheritance, proof of yours. Isabella felt a mix of relief and apprehension. You've known all along? Not all along. I learned the truth about 6 months after we were married, when your mother decided she wanted to formally claim her Westmarch inheritance. Edmund's voice grew bitter. She said she wanted to give you a unified kingdom, a legacy of peace and prosperity. But she died before she could do it. She died because she tried to do it. Edmund stood abruptly, moving back to the window. The car accident wasn't an accident, Isabella. Your mother was murdered by people who couldn't afford to let her unite the kingdoms. So Victoria had been telling the truth about that, at least. But Isabella sensed there was more to the story. Who killed her, father? I don't know for certain. The official investigation turned up nothing, but I had my own people look into it. There were indications of sabotage, evidence that pointed to political assassination, but we could never trace it back to specific individuals. Isabella joined him at the window, watching the lightning illuminate the storm-torn sky. But you suspect someone. I've suspected many people over the years. Political enemies, foreign agents, even. His voice trailed off. Even Victoria. Edmund's silence was answer enough. Isabella felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. Father, do you think Victoria was involved in Mother's death? I don't know what to think anymore. Edmund's voice was full of pain. Victoria, and I married very quickly after your mother's death. At the time, I thought it was because we both needed comfort, companionship. But, looking back, the timing was suspiciously convenient for someone from Westmarch who had rival claims to your mother's inheritance. Isabella realized that both her father and Victoria had been living with suspicions about each other for 15 years, neither willing to voice their fears directly. The revelation explained the tension she had sensed in their marriage, the undercurrent of distrust that had always lurked beneath their public facade of harmony. There's something else you need to know, Edmund continued. I've been receiving messages recently, anonymous letters that suggest someone knows about your true inheritance and plans to use that knowledge against us. Isabella's pulse quickened. What kind of messages? Edmund moved to his desk and retrieved a folder filled with correspondence. They started arriving about 3 months ago, right after your engagement to Alessandro was announced. Look at this one. Isabella read the letter, her hands shaking slightly. Your Majesty, the upcoming coronation presents certain complications given the unresolved matter of the Westmarch succession. Princess Isabella's legitimate claim to both crowns has not been forgotten by all parties. Certain accommodations may be necessary to ensure a smooth transition of power. Further communication will follow. The letter was unsigned and bore no identifying marks, but the implications were clear. Someone was preparing to challenge Isabella's coronation based on her dual inheritance. Have you shown these to Victoria? No. I wasn't sure if I could trust her with this information, given her background and her quick marriage to me after your mother's death. Edmund's admission was painful to hear. Isabella, I've been living in a marriage where I don't know if my wife is my partner or my enemy. Isabella felt a wave of sympathy for both her father and Victoria. They had been trapped in a web of suspicion and fear, each protecting secrets that might have been unnecessary if they had simply trusted each other with the truth. Father, there's something I need to tell you about Victoria. Over the next half hour, Isabella shared everything Victoria had revealed about the Shadow Council, the threats she had received, and her years of silence to protect both Edmund and Isabella from the truth about Elizabeth's assassination. Edmund listened in stunned silence, his emotions cycling from disbelief to anger to a kind of exhausted relief. So she's been protecting us, he said finally. All these years, I thought she might have been involved in your mother's death, and she was actually trying to keep us safe from the real killers. It seems that way. But, Father, there's another problem. Victoria thinks the recent threatening letters might be coming from someone here in Aldermere, someone who knows about the Shadow Council, and is using that knowledge to manipulate the situation. Edmund's face darkened. Someone in my own court is playing games with my family's safety. That's what we think. And there's more. Isabella took a deep breath before delivering the next revelation. Duke Alessandro's family has connections to the Westmarch royal line. His grandmother was one of Mother's cousins. Our engagement might not be the romantic alliance it appeared to be. Edmund sank back into his chair, looking overwhelmed by the cascade of revelations. Alessandro, if his family knows about your inheritance, then the engagement could be part of a larger plan to control the succession. Exactly. Father, I think we need to assume that multiple parties are maneuvering around my coronation, all with different agendas. Some want to prevent the unification of the kingdoms, others want to control it, and still others might want to use the chaos to advance their own claims. What do you propose we do? Isabella looked down at her mother's ring, drawing strength from its presence. I propose we stop being reactive and start being strategic. We need to know exactly who our enemies are, what they want, and how they plan to get it. And then, we need to beat them at their own game. Edmund studied his daughter with new respect. You sound like your mother. She was always 3 steps ahead of her opponents. Then, maybe it's time for me to truly be her daughter. Isabella slipped the ring back onto her finger. But, first, we need to deal with the immediate threat. Someone has been manipulating both you and Victoria, keeping you suspicious of each other while they plan what? A challenge to my coronation? An attempt to force me into a marriage that would give them control over both kingdoms. Or worse, Edmund said grimly. They might be planning to eliminate you entirely and install a puppet ruler who would be easier to control. The thought sent a chill through Isabella, but it also crystallized her resolve. Then, we need to act fast. How much do you trust your inner circle? Edmund considered the question carefully. I trust Chancellor Morrison completely. He served the crown faithfully for 30 years. Lord Admiral Harrison is also above suspicion. But beyond that, he shrugged helplessly. Isabella, one of the hardest lessons of kingship is learning that loyalty can be bought, and bought loyalty can be resold to the highest bidder. Then, we'll work with the people we can trust completely. You, me, Victoria, Margaret, and your most loyal advisors. We'll create our own intelligence network and figure out exactly what's happening. And Alessandro, your engagement? Isabella had been dreading this question, but she knew it had to be addressed. I need to know where he stands before I make any decisions about the marriage. If he's part of a conspiracy against me, then the engagement ends immediately. If he's innocent but being manipulated by his family, then maybe he can be an ally. That's a dangerous game, Isabella. If you confront him and he is involved in a plot against you, you'll be revealing how much you know. Then I won't confront him directly. I'll set a trap and see how he responds. Edmund looked both proud and worried. What kind of trap? Isabella smiled for the first time in hours, and Edmund caught a glimpse of the formidable queen she was destined to become. The kind that will reveal everyone's true loyalties before my coronation. Father, how would you feel about hosting an unexpected diplomatic summit here at Ravencrest Palace? Something that would bring together representatives from all the interested parties. What would be the pretext? A celebration of my engagement to Alessandro, combined with preliminary discussions about trade agreements between Aldermere, Westmarch, and Ravenna. We'll make it seem like a routine diplomatic gathering, but really, it will be an opportunity to observe how everyone behaves when they're all in the same room. Edmund was beginning to see the possibilities. And if there's a conspiracy involving multiple parties, bringing them all together might force them to reveal their hand prematurely. Exactly. Plus, it will give us a chance to make contact with legitimate representatives from Westmarch, people who might know more about the current state of the Shadow Council, and whether there are other claimants to consider. As they discussed the details of their plan, Isabella felt a sense of purpose settling over her like armor. For too long, she had been a passive figure in other people's schemes. Now it was time to take control of her own destiny and claim the legacy her mother had died trying to secure. The storm outside was beginning to abate, but Isabella knew that the real tempest was only just beginning. In the coming days, she would need to walk a careful line between princess and queen, between trust and suspicion, between the safety of ignorance and the dangerous power of truth. But, as she looked at her father, no longer the distant monarch, but her partner in a fight for their family's survival, Isabella realized she was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The ring on her finger was more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a promise to honor her mother's memory and a declaration of war against everyone who thought they could manipulate the future queen of Aldermere and Westmarch. 3 days after the revelation in Victoria's study, Ravencrest Palace buzzed with preparation for the impromptu diplomatic summit. Isabella had thrown herself into the arrangements with an energy that surprised everyone around her, personally overseeing everything from seating charts to security protocols. What appeared to be enthusiasm for diplomatic relations was actually careful orchestration of what she privately thought of as her coronation rehearsal, a chance to see how all the players in her complex inheritance drama would behave when brought together. Margaret had outdone herself with the intelligence gathering. She approached Isabella in the morning room where the princess was reviewing guest lists, her arms full of folders, and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who had spent sleepless nights uncovering secrets. "Your Highness, you're going to want to sit down for this," Margaret said, setting her research on the polished mahogany table. Isabella gestured for her to proceed, while continuing to study the seating arrangements. She had spent hours considering the psychological implications of who sat where, who could see whom, and which conversations might be overheard by which parties. "Duke Alessandro's family tree is fascinating," Margaret began, opening the first folder. "His grandmother, Princess Sophia of Westmarch, was indeed your mother's cousin. But here's what makes it interesting. She was also the woman who contested your mother's claim most vigorously before your mother married your father." Isabella looked up from her charts. "Contested how?" "Sophia claimed that the ancient succession laws had been misinterpreted, that the crown should pass through the male line when no direct male heir existed. She spent years building a case that she, not your mother, was the rightful queen of Westmarch. But mother's claim was validated by the Council of Lords. Yes, but only barely. The vote was 7-5 in your mother's favor, and Sophia never accepted the decision. She married into the Ravenna royal family specifically to build alliances that could help her challenge the ruling later." Isabella felt pieces clicking into place. So Alessandro isn't just connected to the Westmarch succession. His family has been actively working against my mother's line for decades. Margaret nodded gravely. "It gets worse. I found correspondence between Sophia and various Westmarch nobles from right around the time of your mother's death. The letters are coded, but the timing suggests they were planning something significant. Do you think Sophia was part of the Shadow Council?" "I think Sophia might have been the Shadow Council, or at least its leader." Margaret opened another folder. "The mysterious Lord Blackwood that Victoria mentioned? I couldn't find any record of a prominent Blackwood family in Westmarch's recent history, but I did find records of Sophia using Blackwood as an alias in several business transactions. The implications were staggering. If Alessandro's grandmother had been the true leader of the conspiracy against Isabella's mother, then the engagement between Isabella and Alessandro wasn't just politically motivated. It was the culmination of a 30-year plan to seize control of both kingdoms. What about Alessandro himself? How much do you think he knows?" Margaret's expression grew troubled. "That's harder to determine. He was only 8 when your mother died, so he couldn't have been involved in the original plot. But his education was overseen by his grandmother until her death 5 years ago, and some of his recent financial transactions are curious." "Curious how?" "He's been making significant payments to a London-based intelligence firm, the same firm that your father's investigators believe was used to gather information about the Shadow Council. Either he's researching his own family's past, or he's continuing their work." Isabella absorbed this information while considering how to proceed. The diplomatic summit would include Alessandro, representatives from Westmarch, and various other nobles who might have connections to the conspiracy. It was becoming clear that the gathering would be less like a celebration and more like a trap that might spring on her instead of her enemies. "Margaret, I need you to do one more thing. I want you to arrange for additional security, but make it look routine. And I want someone watching Alessandro at all times during his visit." "Of course. Should I inform your father about what we've learned?" "Not yet. I want to see how Alessandro behaves when he arrives before we decide how much to reveal." Isabella stood and moved to the window, looking out at the courtyard where servants were hanging banners and preparing for the arrival of their guests. "And Margaret, I need you to send a message to Victoria. Tell her it's time to contact those Westmarch loyalists she mentioned. If Sophia was manipulating the situation from Ravenna, then the real Westmarch nobles might be as much in the dark as we've been." As Margaret left to carry out her tasks, Isabella allowed herself a moment of uncertainty. She was playing a dangerous game with incomplete information, and the stakes couldn't be higher. If she was wrong about Alessandro's involvement, she might be destroying a relationship with someone who could be her strongest ally. If she was right, she was about to invite her mother's killers into her own home. The arrival of the guests began that afternoon. Isabella positioned herself in the main reception hall, flanked by her father and Victoria, presenting the image of a united royal family welcoming honored guests. She had chosen her outfit carefully, a deep blue gown that complemented her mother's sapphire ring, which she wore prominently on her right hand. Duke Alessandro was among the first to arrive, and Isabella found herself studying him with new eyes as he approached the receiving line. He was undeniably handsome, with dark hair and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. At 26, he carried himself with the confidence of someone born to power, but there was something in his expression that Isabella couldn't quite read. "Princess Isabella," he said, taking her hand and kissing it formally. "You look radiant. I trust the preparations for our wedding continue smoothly." "Of course, Your Grace. Though I must admit, recent conversations with family members have given me new perspective on the importance of understanding one's heritage before taking such significant steps." It was a carefully worded probe, and Isabella watched Alessandro's reaction closely. For just a moment, something flickered behind his eyes: surprise, concern, or perhaps calculation. "Heritage is indeed important," he replied smoothly. "I've always believed that understanding the past is essential for building a secure future." Before Isabella could respond, the next guest in line was announced: Lady Catherine Ashford, representing the Westmarch Cultural Heritage Foundation. Isabella was surprised to see Lady Catherine in an official capacity, but the older woman's slight nod suggested this was part of the plan they had discussed. As Lady Catherine approached, Isabella noticed Alessandro's reaction out of the corner of her eye. He had gone very still, and his grip on his ceremonial sword had tightened almost imperceptibly. "Lady Catherine, what a pleasant surprise to see you here in an official capacity," Isabella said warmly. "Thank you for including our foundation in these important discussions, Your Highness. I believe our organization has valuable insights to offer about historical relationships between our kingdoms." The emphasis on historical relationships was subtle but clear. Lady Catherine was here as more than a cultural representative. She was here as someone who knew the truth about Queen Elizabeth's heritage and was prepared to support Isabella's claim. The formal reception continued with the arrival of various other dignitaries, but Isabella's attention remained divided between observing Alessandro's reactions to different guests and watching for signs of recognition or hostility among the various parties. By the time the last guest had been received, she had identified at least 3 individuals who seemed to know more than they were letting on. The evening's formal dinner provided more opportunities for observation. Isabella had carefully arranged the seating to maximize the potential for revealing conversations. She placed Alessandro to her right, in the position of honor, but positioned Lady Catherine and several other key figures where they could observe his reactions throughout the meal. The conversation during dinner was carefully diplomatic, touching on trade agreements, cultural exchanges, and the importance of maintaining peaceful relations between kingdoms. But Isabella noticed several undercurrents that suggested deeper agendas at play. Lord Marcus Thornfield, one of the Westmarch representatives, seemed particularly interested in discussing succession laws and the historical precedents for unifying kingdoms through marriage. His comments were couched in academic terms, but Isabella recognized them as subtle probes into her knowledge of her own inheritance. "It's fascinating how marriage alliances have shaped European politics for centuries," Lord Thornfield observed during the third course. "The union of kingdoms through strategic marriages often creates complex questions of succession and legitimacy." Alessandro responded before Isabella could speak. "Indeed, though I've always believed that legitimacy comes not just from bloodline, but from the consent of the governed and the ability to rule effectively." It was a diplomatic response, but there was something in his tone that suggested deeper meaning. Isabella decided to test the waters further. "I agree completely," she said, turning her mother's ring so that it caught the candlelight. "Though I've recently learned that sometimes the most important aspects of legitimacy are hidden for generations, only to be revealed when the time is right." This time, the reaction around the table was unmistakable. Lord Thornfield's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Lady Catherine's eyes sharpened with approval, and Alessandro's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Hidden aspects of legitimacy?" asked Ambassador Helena Voss from Ravenna, Alessandro's political advisor. "That sounds rather mysterious, Your Highness." Isabella smiled enigmatically. "Not mysterious, Ambassador. Simply misplaced for safekeeping." The rest of the dinner passed in a haze of carefully worded conversations and meaningful glances. By the time the guests withdrew to the drawing rooms for after-dinner drinks, Isabella felt as though she had been walking through a minefield disguised as a social gathering. She was standing near the windows overlooking the garden, apparently admiring the moonlight, when Alessandro approached her alone for the first time that evening. "Isabella, may I speak with you privately for a moment?" She turned to face him, noting that his diplomatic composure had given way to something more genuine and more troubled. "Of course, Alessandro." He glanced around to ensure they couldn't be overheard, then moved closer. I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll be honest with me. How much do you know about your mother's family history? The direct question caught Isabella off guard, but she decided that this moment called for a calculated risk. I know that she had claims beyond Aldermere. I know that those claims may have contributed to her death, and I know that certain people have been working for years to ensure that her legacy remains buried. Alessandro was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the moonlit gardens. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of suppressed emotion. My grandmother spent her entire life believing that she had been cheated out of her rightful inheritance. She taught me from childhood that your mother had stolen what belonged to our family. But, lately, I've begun to question everything she told me. Isabella felt a flutter of hope mixed with caution. What made you start questioning? Research into my own family's finances revealed some disturbing patterns. Payments to questionable organizations, correspondence with individuals who turned out to be involved in political violence, meetings with people who later disappeared under mysterious circumstances. He turned to look at her directly. Isabella, I think my grandmother may have been involved in your mother's death. The admission hung in the air between them like a bridge that could either connect them or collapse under the weight of their shared history. Isabella realized that this was the moment when she would have to decide whether Alessandro was her enemy, her ally, or simply another victim of the same conspiracy that had destroyed her mother. If that's true, she said carefully, then we may have more in common than either of us realized. Alessandro's expression showed relief, mixed with determination. There's something else. I've been receiving threats recently, messages suggesting that my family's past activities are known to certain parties and could be revealed if I don't cooperate with their plans for our marriage. Threats from whom? I don't know. The messages are anonymous, but they reference details about my grandmother's activities that very few people could know. He paused, then made a decision that seemed to surprise even him. Isabella, I think someone is using both of us. They want our marriage to go forward, but not for the reasons we were told. Isabella felt the final pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. Alessandro, I need to tell you something about my inheritance, and then I need to ask for your help in exposing the people who have been manipulating both our families. As she began to explain the truth about her dual heritage and the conspiracy that had shaped both their lives, Isabella realized that the most important outcome of her diplomatic summit might be the transformation of an arranged marriage into a genuine alliance against their common enemies. But even as hope began to grow, she remained acutely aware that somewhere in the palace around them, the real puppet masters were still pulling strings, and the game was far from over. The revelation that Alessandro might be an ally rather than an enemy changed everything. As Isabella shared the truth about her mother's ring and her dual inheritance, she watched his expression transform from careful diplomacy to genuine shock, then to a fierce determination that gave her hope for the first time in days. So you're the rightful queen of both Aldermere and Westmarch, Alessandro said when she finished explaining. They had moved to a secluded alcove where their conversation couldn't be overheard, but Isabella remained acutely aware that danger could be anywhere. And my grandmother spent 30 years trying to prevent exactly that outcome. It appears so. But, Alessandro, if you've been receiving threats about our marriage, then someone else is now controlling the game your grandmother started. Which means they have access to information about her activities that should have died with her. Alessandro's jaw tightened with anger. Someone has been using her legacy to manipulate me into a marriage that would serve their purposes, not mine or yours. Isabella felt a chill of realization. A marriage that would give them influence over both of us, and, through us, over both kingdoms. Alessandro, what exactly did the threat messages say about our wedding? Alessandro pulled a folded paper from his jacket. I brought the most recent one, thinking I might need to show it to someone tonight. Isabella read the letter, her blood running cold. Duke Alessandro, your cooperation in the upcoming marriage alliance is essential for maintaining certain historical secrets. The princess's coronation will proceed as planned, and your wedding will follow immediately. Any deviation from this timeline or any revelation of past family activities will result in consequences that extend far beyond personal embarrassment. The stability of all three kingdoms depends on your compliance. The implications were staggering. Someone wasn't just trying to control Isabella's inheritance. They were orchestrating a specific timeline that would culminate in her marriage to Alessandro immediately following her coronation. But why? Alessandro, in Ravenna law, what happens to a husband's rights when he marries a reigning queen? Alessandro's face went pale as he understood her meaning. By tradition, he becomes king consort and shares authority over his wife's territories. If you were crowned queen of both Aldermere and Westmarch and then married me immediately afterward, you would have legal claim to governance rights in both kingdoms. And if something happened to me after the marriage, I would inherit the crowns outright. Alessandro looked sick. Isabella, someone isn't just planning to manipulate us. They're planning to eliminate you after the marriage and use me as a puppet ruler. The pieces of the conspiracy were finally becoming clear, and the picture they formed was more sinister than Isabella had imagined. This wasn't just about preventing the unification of kingdoms. It was about seizing control of them entirely. We need to warn my father immediately, Isabella said, but Alessandro caught her arm. Wait, if we expose what we know now, we'll force the conspirators to change their plans, and we might lose our chance to identify all of them. But if we play along while secretly gathering evidence. Isabella understood his reasoning, but the risks were enormous. You're suggesting we continue with the engagement while secretly working against the people who are threatening us. I'm suggesting we turn their own plan against them. Let them think they're controlling us while we identify exactly who they are and what their ultimate goals are. Alessandro's expression was grim, but determined. Isabella, these people killed your mother and manipulated my family for decades. Don't you want to make sure we get all of them? Before Isabella could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps made them both turn. Victoria appeared in the alcove, her face tense with urgency. Isabella, we have a problem. I just received word from one of my Westmarch contacts. There's been a development that changes everything. Isabella's heart sank. What kind of development? A group claiming to represent the legitimate Westmarch nobility has announced their intention to attend your coronation. They say they have evidence that will clarify certain misconceptions about the rightful succession of both kingdoms. Alessandro and Isabella exchanged glances. Victoria, do you think these are real Westmarch nobles or more agents of whoever has been manipulating the situation? I don't know, but their spokesman is someone I recognize, Lord Richard Pemberton. He was one of your mother's strongest supporters in the original succession dispute. If he's coming forward now, it could mean that the legitimate Westmarch nobility has finally decided to support my claim, Isabella finished. Or it could mean that our enemies have gotten to them as well. The complexity of the situation was becoming almost overwhelming. Isabella realized that her simple plan to expose a conspiracy had evolved into something much larger. A three-dimensional chess game involving multiple kingdoms, decades of family feuds, and players whose identities and motivations remained unclear. There's something else, Victoria continued. The announcement specifically mentioned that they would be bringing historical documents and artifacts that prove the true nature of the ancient alliance between Aldermere and Westmarch. Isabella, I think they know about your ring. Isabella instinctively touched her mother's sapphire, which she had been wearing openly since the dinner. If they know about the ring, they know about my dual inheritance. The question is whether they're planning to support it or challenge it. Either way, Alessandro said grimly, it means our timeline just accelerated. Whatever we're going to do, we need to do it before your coronation, or we might find ourselves trapped in a situation we can't control. Over the next hour, the three of them developed a plan that was audacious in its complexity and terrifying in its risks. They would continue to play their assigned roles, Isabella as the dutiful princess preparing for coronation, Alessandro as the devoted fiancé, and Victoria as the supportive stepmother, while secretly gathering evidence about the conspiracy and preparing to expose it at the coronation itself. The plan required them to trust each other completely, despite the years of secrets and suspicions that had divided them. But it also offered the possibility of finally ending a conflict that had shaped their lives for decades. The next morning brought a flurry of new developments. Margaret arrived early with intelligence that made their situation even more complicated. Your Highness, I've been monitoring communications between several of our guests, and I think we have a bigger problem than we realized, Margaret announced, spreading documents across Isabella's desk. What did you find? The threats haven't just been going to you and Duke Alessandro. At least 6 other people at yesterday's gathering have received similar messages, all centered around your coronation and wedding. Isabella studied the intercepted communications Margaret had somehow acquired. The pattern was clear. Someone was orchestrating a complex plan that involved multiple unwilling participants, all being blackmailed or threatened into playing specific roles. Margaret, this is extraordinary work, but how did you? I have my methods, Your Highness. The important thing is that we now know the scope of what we're dealing with. Margaret pointed to one particular document. This message went to Lord Thornfield, the Westmarch representative. He's being told to support a specific interpretation of succession law that would require you to marry Duke Alessandro before you can be crowned, not after. That would make the marriage legally necessary for me to inherit either crown, Isabella realized. It would eliminate my ability to choose my own path. Exactly. And this message went to Ambassador Voss from Ravenna. She's being instructed to present formal documents during the coronation ceremony that would legally bind you to the marriage alliance as a condition of accepting the crown. Isabella felt the walls closing in around her. The conspiracy wasn't just about controlling her marriage. It was about legally trapping her in a position where she would have no choice but to comply with their plans. There's one more thing, Margaret said hesitantly. I found evidence that someone has been monitoring all of our communications for months. They know about our conversations, our research, possibly even our plans. The revelation was like a physical blow. If their enemies had been watching them all along, then every move they had made might have been anticipated and countered. Do we know who has access to our communications? That's the problem. It could be anyone with the right connections and resources. But, Your Highness, I think it's time to consider that the threat might be coming from inside the palace itself. Isabella sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the realization that she might have no safe allies and nowhere to turn. But, as she looked at Margaret's worried face and thought about Alessandro's determination to expose his grandmother's legacy, she realized that giving up wasn't an option. Margaret, I want you to arrange a private meeting with my father, Victoria, and Alessandro. Tell them we need to discuss security arrangements for the coronation, but make sure the meeting happens somewhere that hasn't been used for any previous conversations. Where did you have in mind? Isabella smiled grimly. The old chapel in the East Wing. It's been closed for renovations for months, and I doubt anyone has thought to monitor it. That evening, the 5 conspirators, for that's what they had become, gathered in the dusty, half-renovated chapel. Moonlight streamed through the ancient stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across their faces as they discussed their final strategy. The way I see it, we have one chance to expose this conspiracy and take control of the situation, Isabella began. During the coronation ceremony itself, in front of representatives from all the kingdoms involved, we reveal everything, my dual inheritance, the threats and manipulation, and the identity of everyone who has been pulling the strings. The risks are enormous, Edmund pointed out. If we're wrong about any of this, we could destroy diplomatic relationships that have taken years to build. And, if we're right, we could end a conspiracy that has been destroying lives for decades, Isabella countered. Father, these people killed my mother. They've been threatening our family and our allies for months. How much more are we willing to tolerate? Alessandro leaned forward in his chair. I vote we do it. But we need to be absolutely certain we can prove everything we're claiming. Accusations without evidence will only make us look paranoid or delusional. Victoria pulled out a collection of documents and artifacts she had been gathering. I have correspondence from the original Shadow Council, financial records showing payments to various operatives, and testimony from people who witnessed some of the meetings where my cooperation was coerced. Margaret added her own collection of evidence. And I have the intercepted communications showing the current scope of the conspiracy, plus some very interesting information about financial connections between several of our recent guests. Edmund looked around the group, his expression showing both pride and concern. You're asking me to gamble the stability of the monarchy on the hope that we can.